Здравствуйте, я Niel McLean, я работаю в Vector Technology в дом. Вы понимаете? Вы понимаете? Я Niel McLean. Vector. Okay, my Russian ain't that great. And of course, I was waiting for the simultaneous translation to kick in. And you could say, it's my job turning up at a conference in England to speak English. Or I could say, hold on a minute, meet me halfway. And we could have gone for, I don't know, as I say, simultaneous translation. And I looked at the prices of that over the weekend, and we could whack that on the top and charge you all an extra 12 quid to come here. In which case, some of you might not have been able to come. So, very first point I want to make at the start of all this is inclusion is complicated. And anybody who thinks they can point to a simple, straightforward way of dealing with this by doing this or that or whatever is simply wrong. And like in the introduction, I sometimes think that English isn't my first language, it's my second. My problem is I don't necessarily have a first one. Can we have some of the slides up? They're there behind me. Let's see if they move on. I want to tell a little bit of a story about home access. This one. But I want to lead into that with a discussion about wider inclusion issues. I've just picked up some of the things that people look at when they think about inclusion. They think about recognizing ethnic diversity. They think about recognizing sexual diversity. They think about recognizing issues to do with gender. They think about recognizing things to do with economic status. There's a whole raft of things when people talk about inclusion that they talk about. And there's an interesting thing that those of you who have a background in inclusion will know that one of the strong tenets of the whole inclusion debate is that being inclusive is about celebrating diversity. If I think about the West London school that my kid goes to, there's kids in wheelchairs in the schools, there's kids with Asperger's in the kids, there's kids from the former Soviet Union, there's kids from Somalia, and the school celebrates diversity. And yeah, it's been brilliant for me to have my kid grow up surrounded by that diversity and to go to other people's homes and to grow up like that. There's one on the list there that I have a little bit of a problem. I'm not so sure it's a good thing to celebrate economic diversity. I'm not sure it is a source of celebration that some people earn over 1,000 times more than some people do. Now, you'll work out whether that's a political point or not. But my second point, if one that inclusion is difficult and inclusion is complicated, there's a particular issue around economic exclusion. It's actually slightly different to the rest. And I think that legitimizes particular sorts of action because it is different. In a remarkable, absolutely astonishing degree of self-confidence, in 1942, Winston Churchill asked, that's Lord Beveridge, he was a liberal reformer, introduced the national insurance earlier on, asked Beveridge to prepare for Britain after the end of the war. 1942, just those of you who know a bit of history, that's an incredibly self-confident thing to do. And Beveridge came up with this brilliant thing, which I think shaped a lot of our thinking around inclusion. He talked about fighting the great 5 evils: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. I think that's a fantastic list. And I think it's fantastic and seismic in the extent of its change for one very, very particular reason. It said that it isn't just the role of the state to concern itself if people are economically excluded around, to use the Maslow's hierarchy kind of thing, the stuff at the bottom. People have always felt if people were starving, you should really try and do something about it. People have always felt if people are being rained on, you should try and do something about it. The seismic thing that Beveridge introduced after the war, and has been part of the thinking ever since, is that some things about how people live their lives, the positive things, the enjoyment they're getting out of engaging positively with doing things, education, are as much part of the legitimate role of the state, ensuring access to those things, as making sure people don't get rained on or die of TB. That's an astonishingly seismic shift. And we know some things around low socioeconomic status. This diversity is not for celebration. I don't want to go through all of those things, but there's a whole set of predictors which are absolutely down to the economic background in your home. Now, interestingly, this is less a predictor in Scotland, interestingly, so there's something going right in Scotland that isn't going right so much in England. But these are predictors. Going through some of the lists there. If you really wanted to do something about making the world more inclusive, you'd prioritise economic exclusion. You'd prioritise doing something about that because of all the things it leads into. Let's move on. You'll either believe me when I say this, or you won't believe me. Whenever you have a technological change, it does two things. Not only does it potentially introduce new inequalities, and I'll come to some of those in a minute, it exacerbates existing ones. And that's been true of every technology that's been introduced. Not only has it exacerbated existing ones, differences get bigger when they were first introduced, it's introduced a whole new set of inequalities around access. The sources of all this are at the bottom, and again, I'm assuming that you can see all this. But if you look at this, is a powerful argument about the all-prevailing evidence about technology. The stuff that we've done shows how you can factor out other sorts of things, and there's still a technology effect, and it's still related to economic exclusion. So, where does that leave us specifically on the technology agenda? About 2 years ago, after a bit of toying in this space, the then schools minister, Jim Knight, said, is there a case for actually intervening at state level in the spirit of Beveridge, in the spirit of recognising that it is legitimate for the state to go beyond just the basics of are you starving? Is there a compelling case that says there is an inequality here, there is an impact on other sorts of things, and if there is a case, how best should we intervene? And after a year of doing an economic appraisal, working out the impact of being online, and I'm with you, it's absolutely about choice. My parents probably won't go online. To be honest, my parents can afford not to. They can afford to waver the £300 that a low-income family would save by going online. They can afford to do that, and they can make the choice. Okay? A set of pilots and a whole range of different things. A business case was constructed around the access to technology at home. And I'm going to walk you through this business case because there are all sorts of things in it that have got interesting problems sitting behind them, which are part of a bigger debate. So the first part of the business case, the justification for an intervention, was the compelling evidence that exists now, and we've spent, I think, John, when I first did something about home access, I think it was 1998, around access to formal learning at home. Now, I long for a day when we don't judge people on A stars to C's, 3 numbers of what they get in national tests at the age of 11, and qualifications at age 18. I long for that day, but it is not here yet. What's a simple fact of life, and reason the Treasury likes things like 5 A stars to C's is they can do actuarial data on it. Because these qualifications have been around for a while, they can track people throughout their lives, and they know how much more or how much less people earn and the opportunities they have on the basis of these. Now, I'd prefer to change the world, but I can't. So one part of this business case is around the impact of this technology and the access to this technology at home on extending formal education opportunities into the home. And we've got evidence around that from the Suffolk and Oldham pilot that we've just run about extra hour a day if you value this sort of thing spent on extending learning from the formal side. There's also something that I'm very, very keen on, which is the second part of the case for the intervention, which says that learning doesn't chop up quite as neatly as the formal and informal, even though the qualification system recognises one and not the other. Learners learn, and they have lives, and they move through them. And there's a second part of the business case, which is around stronger links between home learning, informal learning, and formal learning, and allowing the learner and the learning to be more seamless. There's a third part of the business case, which again links to the inclusion agenda. I'm sort of slightly provocative in a way. If you want to do well at Key Stage 1 leading into the first 2 years of Key Stage 2, choose your parents and your postcode. The impact of both of those is bigger than the school or the teacher level effect when you do all this complicated multivariate analysis of impact of various factors. And the single thing, this is the Charles DeForge research, that's the big predictor, is the degree to which parents themselves get involved in the education of the child. It's not whether the parents, by the way, are on the PTA or any of that kind of stuff. It's about the extent to which the parents actively get involved in the education of the child. And there's interesting things, without talking about cultural hegemony and a whole range of things, that say that that is also predictable by earning level, by family income. Families with particular level income are more, the parents are more likely to engage with the learning. And we did a report about this, the Own Nothing Much report, which basically said, you know, can we move a bit from, and that's the issue about parents having access to what kids are doing at school, absolutely right, absolutely central to this. So when the kid comes home and the parent says, what do you do at school today? A question requiring a high degree of metacognition, by the way. They don't just grunt, they say, let me show you. And you're talking about something concrete because you can show you, rather than going through an abstracted thing. There's the other parts of the business case are around access to other sorts of things for the wider family. Unsurprisingly, in low-income families, the parents tend to be low-skilled. Not universally, but they tend to be low-skilled. So we've had our first examples through the Home Access Programme of parents getting jobs as a result of the Home Access Programme. Partly because of the skills they've developed very quickly, but through using it with the support of people like Helen's operation, but also because they've got a way of sharing their CV and doing some of those sorts of things. Also, it's partly about those widest personal, social and economic benefits. As I say, we know from the Post Office and other research, people like us save about £750 a year being online. As I say, if you're low income, it's not the same because you don't go on those sorts of holidays or do those sorts of things, but you can save about 200 quid. And then there is something else for the system, which there was something that was said in the introduction that really resonated with me. The number of times I've spoken in front of groups of teachers and said, this is all very well, but some of our kids don't have access at home, so we couldn't possibly. It's the reason that in the first week of this term, I got 8 pieces of paper home with my 8-year-old. And I got 8 pieces of paper home because Sergei's family do not have access, because Akim's family do not have access at home, because, and I go on. And so the school rightly says, we shouldn't be just tailoring for one bit of the thing, we're going to do this sort of thing. Okay? So there's something about an argument, a business argument, about the overall transformation of this. The other thing that the task force said is, and this was completely misreported at the time, you got the impression that Jim Knight and ministers were going to go around with a van doling out laptops on council estates. Was long-term sustainability for all of this is about people taking ownership. So it's not a central procurement, it's a grant. And if you're entitled, you apply for the grant. If you don't want the grant, you don't apply for the grant. But if you want the grant, you get a nice little card, which is a Barclay card, and you do exactly the same as I do. You go to one of those shops and you behave in exactly the same way as I do when I go in. Because you've got this card that empowers you to do that. If you want to add to it, you do that, those sorts of things. But that was very strong. It was an idea that from the outset, as much as is possible, within all the bizarre EU regulations, all that sort of stuff that some of you spend your time struggling with, it's a grant that empowers the individual to make choice, so they take ownership from the outset. Otherwise, why should they carry on when it turns over to be their turn to pay for the connection or those sorts of things? Do it, if it's something that someone else has parachuted into their house. Very strong kind of thing, and very strong evidence. We've got Mori evaluating this, talking to them. You need to do it at scale, you know, talking to the households along with SQW, another company, listening to people, and this was very, very popular. Where we're trying to get to is we're not trying to stuff technology down people's throats. We're not, to take your point. What I'd like to get to is socio-economic factors no longer being a predictor. If we know that people are making choices, people are making choices. But if we can see a graph that says home computer access ownership is at this level if you earn this amount of money, this level if you earn this amount of money, this level if you earn this amount of money, and this level if you earn this amount of money, I'd like to see a flat one, please. Because then we know that it isn't the amount of money you've got that's predicting whether you have access to technology for your family and your child. It's other choices you've made. So that's the aspiration of the program. And we are playing catch-up. Social factors, economic factors. So quickly go through how it works. You can ask people. You hear about it. There's central administration looking after all this. You apply for it. You fill in an application form. I was terrified about that because, I think 100 iterations did the application form go through as we developed it in conversation with people, going into people's homes, seeing how they filled it in, talking to people, getting the feedback. It takes about 20 minutes to fill in. If any of you find that a shockingly large amount, you are not of the community we're talking about. Because the feedback we've had is they typically take them 2 hours to fill in the forms they get from other places. They spend their lives filling in forms. So I was quite pleased that we got it down to 20 minutes. You apply, you get the card, you go off, you behave exactly the same as anybody else. And there you are. And I thought, this is a bit cheesy for me to show you this, but I quite like it. If we could have the video, please. No, it worked at the start of this. To hear from some of the parents. If we can't do it, doesn't matter. You'll just have to trust me, and I'll show you some quotes in the next slide. Can you play the video? No, can't play the video. Let's move on to the next slide. We'll stick it on the Vector website, and it's on the website. People can actually look for it. Let's move on to the next slide then, and I'll pick up some quotes. Can we move on to the next slide? The one before that. I'm quite capable of going back to speaking Russian, of course, and doing other sorts of things while we wait. While we wait for those quotes, I'll do this bit I was going to do afterwards. We piloted this in 2 local authorities, Oldham and Suffolk. For those of you who aren't from these parts, Oldham is a small, northern, ex-industrial, multi-ethnic area. Suffolk is a very mixed area. There's some posh bits, Bury St Edmunds, and there's some very not posh bits. And we wanted to see how this played in both of those. We had a target to reach, I can't remember, I think it was something like 60% of the available people by September. That's the people in the income group we were trying to reach. And remember, this is something they apply for, not something we stuff down people's throats. We hit our target after 3 months. We'd got to that level of take-up. And this was in spite of people from Inland Revenue and whatever saying, I don't think you understand quite how hard it is to reach this group of people. And me thinking, yeah, but I don't think you understand quite how much they will want what we've got to offer here. Where we are now, we went back to ministers and said, do we shut up because we met our targets 5 months early, or whatever it is? Or do you want us to carry on and seeing where we get to with this in these 2 local authorities? Where we got to is 92% of the eligible low-income families in those 2 local authorities took up the offer. And all by a tiny, tiny number have done the thing of applying, going through, making the purchase, and they're now up and learning using the technology. I think I ought to stop there. I'm not going to read out these quotes. We've got loads of these. We've got letters, we've got stories, we've got phone calls, we've got people saying, this has changed our lives. You know? And it's quite an astonishing thing to do. And over the next year, we're going to reach another 250,000 low-income households through this. This is not government rhetoric. This is a single-minded programme aimed at closing an unacceptable gap that, as I say, over the next year is going to reach 250,000 low-income families. Thank you very much for listening.
Some questions. Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you, Neil. We have miraculously stayed on time, so let's squeeze in a couple of questions for Neil, if we have any. But if you can wait until the microphone, oh, the microphone's right next to you, that was good. We have one question here. Anybody else wants to ask a question so I can tee them up? Nothing yet, okay, thank you.
Andrew Trimble from Kingston. What would the national target to reach these sort of families be, Neil?
Sorry?
What would the national target be to reach these families?
Well, in the first phase, I've got to be a bit careful about this because we all read the newspapers and know there are events that might interfere with all of this kind of thing. We want to reach 750,000 learners through their families. Yeah? That's what I want to do. And I have to caveat all of this, you know, if we're in different sorts of things, because we all know the circumstances economically, and we all know those sorts of things. We all know there's political kind of things. As I've said in the various local authority conferences when we were explaining how all this is going to work, that's why we're going to go like a rocket. You know? We're going to make this happen. And that's why we're going to get to those first 250,000 families quickly.
One question right in the middle here. Thank you.
Patrick Coucher, Sandwich Technology School. Having tried to run a anytime, anywhere learning project in my school, the issues that we faced were repairing machines when they fall down. And the other thing I'm a bit concerned about with regards to what's being said in the home access, how long does the scheme last for? In other words, if someone signs up, how do they then get support to keep on having internet access? What happens when in 3 years' time the device is out of date and dead?
Okay, let's take the first bit first, and let me stress again, the first bit, you're absolutely right, and it's an utter pain for schools, and that's why we've gone for the model that we've gone for. This is about individual families' ownership. It's about schools then realising the benefits on individual ownership. But the school that my kid goes to doesn't look after my technology. The juggling lessons aren't paying off, Graham. The school that my kid goes to does not maintain my technology. I do that. I take responsibility for that. That's mine. I'll make the commitment. And that's why the scheme talks directly to the low-income family. And it's a grant for them to go and take over and behave exactly the same as anybody else. Now, what we've built into the scheme is support for them around it, and the suppliers are required to provide that support. Because, again, it's not the school's role to do that. What the school, I would argue, needs to think about is, hey, if we suddenly remove that excuse that 3 kids haven't got access so we can't do something, it's to think more creatively about things that go on top of that. In terms of the rollout of the scheme, I'm not going to say anything about that. Because all we've got is 2 things. We've got a commitment for a certain amount of money, and you'll have seen it was 300 million when it was announced, which gets to 1 point, and a commitment from this government through the Home Access Task Force to review when it gets to that point. I would be bonkers to go any further than that, wouldn't I? In current economic, political, and other circumstances. And again, that's why we've designed it. We've got a thing called the Month 13 project, which is about how we work with the children's charities and others, the charity that supports single parents, to get people to the point that they recognise a compelling argument for them as a family to carry on supporting this thing. And that's why we sort of describe it rather cheesily as a leg up, not a handout kind of thing. Now, personally, I'd like to go back to whoever is the government of the day and have the argument about continuation. But we'll have to have that conversation when we get to that point. But let me reassure you up front, one of the things we were absolutely clear in the design of this was it should not put burden on schools around support, administration, whatever, and some schemes do. nor should it put burden on local authorities around those sorts of things, and some schemes have done. We centralise the administration and we empower the family. That's the idea behind it. Okay?
Okay, let's move on now. Can I have a round of applause for Niel again on that thing? Great. Thanks, Niel.